Stu, so good to see you, mate. How are things in Colorado Springs? I'd love an update, on how things are going with this whole COVID-19 thing.
Yeah, Jason, it is so good to reconnect, to allow technology for us to be able to do this, 15 hours apart on a plane. And now here we are in real time. This is fantastic. Colorado's great. I mean, all things considered, right? We're in the midst of coronavirus. And so to just be able to, set aside some time to connect with long ago friends who are now somewhere in a different part of the world. I guess that's one of the blessings of having a different kind of schedule than we're used to maintaining. So doing great. And it's great to see you.
Mate, awesome to see you as well. I wanted to just let you know how grateful I am. You were the first person when I moved to Colorado Springs that reached out to me and said, hey, I'd like to connect, and heard that you just started a new role at this church called Red Rock Church, and would love to just meet you and get to know your story. And I'm forever grateful for that, because it's really an example of being a great friend and a great leader in a community. But I'm also equally as grateful because you introduced me to Bingo Burger, which is still my favorite burger joint in all of Colorado Springs. So thank you so much for both of those gifts. And you've been a great friend over the years, and I'm really grateful for that.
Well, you're welcome. Every time I go into Bingo Burger, I think about that conversation that we had. So the next time I'll have one in your name.
There we go. Yeah. In fact, I would love it if you would just tell us a little bit about yourself for those that maybe don't know who you are listening to the podcast. Give us a little bit of background on yourself, and then really we can talk a little bit about this organization you work with, COSILoveYou, in Colorado Springs, which in some ways there was some ideas and concepts that were birthed out of that conversation at a Bingo Burger joint. And so tell us, though, a little bit about yourself, just to give people some context, those that are listening.
Yeah. So my name is Stu Davis. I'm a husband. I'm a dad. I'm a former pastor. I am somebody who's lived in Colorado Springs here now for 16 years, almost 17. And it's just been, I consider myself kind of someone who gets the privilege of sitting at the intersection of the church and the city. And for me, I love that role as somebody who spent a decade in pastoral ministry at a larger local church here in Colorado Springs, and then a handful of years in a different part of the country before that. I loved my years in pastoral ministry, but then spent the next subsequent several years working at a local rescue mission. Here in Colorado Springs, it's called the Springs Rescue Mission. It's our largest local service provider, faith-based or not, for folks who are facing homelessness, addiction, and a number of other just kind of challenges related to extreme poverty. And so really getting the opportunity to see from a civic perspective some of the crises, some of the situations, some of the problems and the challenges that our city has to deal with was just a real eye-opener for me. And to serve under leaders who, not in a brash or hurtful way, but in a kind and very constructive way, brought their faith to the table, but didn't allow that to be either the thing that set them aside as good leaders or the thing that kind of made them perceived as poor leaders. It was just a part of the makeup of who they were, but they brought that to the table as they tried to create solutions collaboratively with other civic entities trying to figure out the problems of homelessness in our own city. That was just a great education for me. And so to be able to kind of meld some of the background that I've been able to have with church ministry, with kind of social service agency work, doing a lot of work with churches, but trying to bring churches to the table with our city. Those are things that I've just gotten the chance to be involved in over the last handful of years that have really just lit my fire for what I'm doing now, which is really working with churches of all different sizes, kinds, traditions, backgrounds, across our community, the Pikes Peak region of Southern Colorado, and trying to bring them to the community, to the city, to say, what can we do to best help support and work with our city leaders on some of the things that face us as a city together.
Yeah. So you, Stu, right now in your role, you are kind of a bridge between church leaders or faith leaders, civic leaders at the city level and government level and that type of thing, and then also business leaders in the business community. and trying to connect kind of that triangle of leadership within the city to do some great projects and to really love on the city and try to make the city the best it possibly can be. Would that be a good description of what you do?
Yeah, and I talk a fair amount about, and this is not an academic term, it's just the best way that I can think of to talk about it, kind of the civic triangle, where at each of the 3 points, you've got the people you just described. You've got civic leaders, business leaders, and faith community leaders. And oftentimes when it comes to social challenges, to issues that any community might face, big or small, the attempts to try and address some of those issues, each of the people in those three parts of the triangle care and they want to do something to help, but oftentimes the solutions are disconnected from other parts of the triangle. And so really what COSILoveYou does is really trying to create more collaborative solutions that allow for some conversation to happen, for some coordination. I'm using a lot of C words, but a lot of communication to happen around these issues so that when we go to tackle some of these challenges together, the resource pool is greater, the buy-in is greater, and there's more synergy because there's kind of agreement on a common direction. One of the things that frustrated me for so long when I was at the rescue mission, which is where I was when you and I got to know each other, is I would see probably almost certainly on a weekly basis, my second floor office kind of overlooked the parking lot area where, we had homeless folks and addicts and other people who were, they just walked onto the campus to find something that they needed. And on a regular basis, I would see a van, oftentimes a church van, more often than not, would pull up onto our parking lot or up onto the curb right next to it, and a handful of smiley-faced people with matching t-shirts would all spill out and start handing out sandwiches and sleeping bags. And I appreciated what they were trying to do, and oftentimes I would be the one that was called on to go out and talk with these folks, and I'd just say, hey, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for your compassion and for wanting to serve some of these folks. But did you know that a lot of these folks just ate an hour ago? A lot of them are going to get the opportunity to have another meal in a couple hours, and frankly, all of them have sleeping bags. And more often than not, the sleeping bags they're going to get, which frankly aren't enough to go around to everybody who wants one, is probably not going to be used for the purposes that you think they will be. So why don't you guys come and bring all that volunteerism, all that, desire to serve? Could you just come and help us serve the next meal? And unfortunately, so often I was met with the response of, no thanks, we're good. We just wanted to come down and kind of do our good deed for the day. We're going to go back and tell our church how great it was to serve a bunch of homeless folks. And it just made me sad because in addition to kind of undermining some of the work that the rescue mission was trying to do on a day-to-day basis, some of the overarching strategy that our community leaders and social service agencies had agreed on for not doing public distribution of goods and those kinds of things, it was also demonstrating a real lack of connection with a desire to really serve. It was really more about the people who were serving rather than the people who were being served. And so for me, I think, and this is, I think, something we're going to find ourselves talking about in a few minutes, I've just grown such a huge desire to see the faith community walk into a conversation with city leaders around some major social issue and say, how can we help? What are the things that we can do to best contribute our resources to this challenge? Rather than showing up with all the solutions we already think are helpful.
Stu, I want to just say thank you for sharing that, first of all, because it reminded me as I'm listening to you that you were the first one to really educate me as a church leader and a pastor, because I had like those people in the van, I had a desire to do something, but you educated me on a different perspective. And I think a lot of church leaders, it comes from a right heart. For some, and I don't mean to throw anyone under the bus, but for some, it's the great Instagram picture for your church's Instagram page to be able to take a photo with your church van down by the rescue mission, handing out sandwiches and sleeping bags. And I don't want to be cynical and say that that's everyone's goal, but that's a reality. That is for some what their end game might have been, like the person that goes on a mission trip and they want to get the picture with all the kids around them in Africa where they've dug a well and they've never dug a hole in their backyard, let alone dug a well on the other side of the world. Yeah. And so I don't want to be cynical and say that everyone's doing that. And there are many faith leaders that have a right heart and they want to do something. But you open my mind and my eyes to another perspective, or many different perspectives other than just the church's perspective. And quite frankly, what it led me to understand is that the solution that the church quite possibly will be best able to provide is less about coming up with the solution, but partnering with those experts in the community who already understand and spend every day thinking about the solution. And you could just maybe come along and blow some wind in their sail instead of thinking you can solve the problem, rather be a part of the solution that they've already got going. And that, at least for me, was a huge education. And I just want to say thank you for being gracious and kind to me and many other church leaders, as you graciously, and you did do it graciously, educated us on the fact that there are people in this city that wake up every day thinking about solving the crisis of homelessness or poverty or lack of food or whatever it is. And perhaps you think about it once or twice a year, or maybe during a message series, and what would look like if you partnered with these experts instead of trying to solve it. Now, anyway, I'm just incredibly grateful for the work that you do and for helping to educate leaders in so many different areas. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm thankful for leaders like you who listen, who don't just say, no, we haven't figured out. Thanks. I'm good. I mean, there, and it's important to acknowledge the van that pulls up is doing so out of a desire to help.
Yes.
And so people do want to help. The question is, are they willing to listen if a different solution is brought forward that actually might be more helpful? So,
yeah.
Anyway.
I've talked with many church leaders over the years, Stu, and I've told them a little bit of the story of 'Cause I Love You. And one of the things that I hear oftentimes is they have a heart to help, like the people bringing the van with the sandwiches and the sleeping bags, but they also have a desire for unity, where maybe a collaboration of churches in the city could do something greater than just one church doing it on its own. And they heard the story of 'Cause I Love You, and they were inspired by that. Could you walk us through a little bit of the history of 'Cause I Love You? Because you've been a part of it from the very beginning. Even before I got to Colorado Springs, you were a part of this story. And then do it in such a way, if you could, that might be helpful for a church leader who's in a city saying, man, I'm inspired by that. What maybe are some practical next steps I could do with the 2 or 3 other church leaders, or the 20 or 30 other church leaders that I'm connected with? Could you do that for us?
Yeah, sure. And I'll give you my version of the story, knowing that there are other folks who are working in parallel with me who could talk about their own journey. But I got the chance to be a part of it in a fairly central role as it was beginning. And so there are some cool things that really God orchestrated. So one of which was I think it was the fall of maybe 2014, I got a chance to go listen to a gentleman speak whose name is Ray Bakke, Bakke. He now calls the Pacific Northwest in the United States home. He had spent a long portion of his ministry career in the Chicago area. Ray wrote a book a number of years ago called A Theology as Big as the City. And yes. I was early on into my time at the Springs Rescue Mission. I was at a gathering of leaders who work at rescue missions around the country. Got a chance to hear Ray speak, and I thought, and we were at the time in Colorado Springs really beginning to experience a crisis with regard to homelessness in our city. Okay. We were behind as a community in terms of size and scale of resources because of our economy, because of our geographic setting. There were more and more folks who were coming to Colorado Springs. Frankly, marijuana had been legalized not too recently, and so there were more folks who were coming in to just access legal weed. And so we just were experiencing kind of this explosion of folks who either were homeless or were presenting themselves as homeless. And so the city was really kind of feeling this tangible pressure around what do we do with this kind of growing number of people who are in need of service. Ray's message was just right on point about, and he, I don't want to steal away from the book. People need to read the book, but this idea of how do we bring the church to the city? How does the church become a city's greatest advocate and partner? Those are my words, but that's a summary of kind of some of what Ray's theology was. And so I invited Ray to come and speak. Not too many months later, Ray came. We did a number of gatherings with everybody from our mayor and civic and economic leaders, elected, appointed officials, to just grassroots church planters and kind of everybody in between. Small gatherings, essentially to just say, hey, we all know that this is an issue. How do we think about this rightly? And what have been some experiences that a faith community, a group of leaders within the faith community might be able to do to address this alongside city leaders? And that just kind of began a series of conversations, again, around the issue of homelessness. And it doesn't have to be homelessness, but I think that was an important thing, was to have one issue, a central cause or some sort of catalytic cause that everybody feels and everybody can kind of at least understand in some way. Nobody truly understands homelessness. It's very complex. But it at least allowed us to have some point of conversation to start convening people around. And for all the people who were raising their hands saying, well, yeah, I care about homelessness. I care about that person who's standing on the street corner or the person who showed up to my church looking for help this week. It allowed us to be able to at least gain common audiences. And so
Stu,
what that did,
I think, Stu, sorry to interrupt, but I think that is a critical point. As I think back to the history of 'Cause I Love You and this movement, that's incredible what God has done with it. There was a unifying thing in this cause of helping to solve, or not solve, but helping to meet the need of this homeless population in our city, our neighbors that were experiencing homelessness at that time. I remember a meeting that we had with, a number of church leaders, and we've got in Colorado Springs, there are some brilliant church leaders, and one that really stands out to me is a guy named Glenn Packiam. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget Glenn saying, throughout church history, poverty and prayer have been unifying factors for churches, no matter denomination, no matter background or size and those kinds of things. There's something within the heart of Jesus followers that can unify around prayer and poverty. And to me, that was a key thing in those early days, that we had a unifying cause that helped us to kind of put things to the side, projects that we were each working on as individual churches, and say, hey, what about if we all worked around this one thing? Sorry, go on.
Yeah. No, that's all right, because it was actually that gathering. It was that common theme that allowed us to have a gathering, the one you're describing. We brought as many church leaders as we could. And I busted my tail for months trying to get about 120 pastors in a room to simply listen to our mayor. Yeah. And we made it very clear, and you were a part of the convening of a gathering like this, where we said, we're not going to pass the mic. This isn't a chance for you to stand in front of the mayor and say, hey, what are you going to do about the traffic issues in front of my church, or whatever it was. I made it very clear to the mayor, you got 30 minutes, and you don't need to worry about somebody reacting or responding positively or negatively to what you're saying. We're simply here to listen. And then everybody that came in the door, we reminded them and say, hey, you're here to listen. You're here to listen. You're here to listen. And so we just spent 30 minutes. And frankly, the mayor, because this was the first time that we had done this, I don't think he quite trusted that we weren't going to pass the mic. So he kind of talked through any kind of Q&A time he thought. So he talked for almost 50 minutes. But at the same time, what we heard that day was the mayor issuing an invitation to the leaders of these 120 churches around our city, again, of all different kinds, saying, hey, homelessness is a challenge. You care about it. I care about it. The things that we want to do about it are probably different, but I'm asking for you to help and join me in trying to figure this thing out. And that was a real catalyst, because over the next couple of years, as you well know, we saw churches by the dozen who joined together from different traditions, from different backgrounds, from different parts of the city, some who were wealthy and didn't know a single homeless person in their church, other churches who were filled with homeless people because that's who they ministered to, all in between, gathered together. And we found specific, tangible things that we could do, whether it was help raise money to stand up a larger shelter in town, or it was working together on a public campaign to try and address panhandling, which really was, a significant challenge. And I think for any believer who's sitting at a stoplight and they see somebody outside their window who's holding a sign, there's this internal struggle of how do I respond biblically in a Christ-like manner to that person. So we worked with civic leaders on how do we approach these challenges, and the simplicity of the message that came out of that process, being able to work with civic leaders, it built trust and rapport with those civic leaders. Our mayor is now one of our biggest fans, and he's always sending me messages. He's always, hey, Stu, what do you think we could do with churches to address this challenge? Because we came through on one thing, and because we didn't come with all of our solutions prescribed, we just came and listened and then took action based on what we heard our city leaders saying. That's built and established so much trust that it's not only been more invitational for churches to get involved, it's also been much easier for civic leaders to understand that we really are here to help.
Yeah. As I listen to this, Stu, man, there's so many key takeaways that, if you're a church leader, or even if you're just a person in your community who says, I want my community to be a better place and I'd love to love on the community, I'm hearing a number of things. Listening to civic leaders is a big one, with no agenda, no strings attached, just saying, I'm here because I want to help and I want you to tell us how we could best help. That's number one. Number two is to have a unifying thing or project, or something that people can rally around. Instead of trying to do 5 or 10 or 20 things, do one thing really well, because that will help you establish trust with those civic leaders that you've been listening to. So those are some key takeaways as I hear you talking about this. Talk to me a little bit more about this idea then of, we've got the ball rolling around one big idea. We've listened to the mayor, we've listened to the civic leaders, and we begin this relationship where we're building trust. What does it look like to then get church leaders, civic leaders, and business community people then working together once we've got the relationships established and perhaps the project or the cause established? What's next? What are the next steps?
Yeah, a couple of things on that. One is, I mentioned that we had Ray Bakke come into town, who spoke, did a good job just creating a platform, an easy platform for a lot of people to engage in. I felt like that was kind of step A. And a gentleman that Ray had introduced me to, who's up the road in Denver, which is an hour north of Colorado Springs. His name is Dave Runyon. Dave had written a book not too many years before called The Art of Neighboring. And Ray said, you should reach out to Dave and just talk. So Dave and I chatted on the phone, and I said, Dave, we had Ray come in, did a great job kind of convening this conversation, but that was step A. What's step B, C? He's been doing some kind of unified city things in Denver for a bit. And that's when he said, well, who's the most sought after or kind of trusted voice of leadership in your community? And I said, well, that's easy. That's our mayor. And he was the one who suggested that we try to get people in a room with the mayor to listen. So I give a lot of credit to Dave. And so I think that was a good second step, was trying to, who is that person? And it doesn't have to be an elected official. It could be somebody who's very much kind of perceived as trustworthy, or who's maybe kind of an emeritus member of the community in some way, but somebody who's a trusted voice and who's got their finger on the pulse of what's happening in the community. And then the other thing that I felt like was really helpful for us is, I'm one guy. I was working with a couple of other collaborators. You were one. We had a guy who was working in one of our downtown offices, civic offices, who was another. So there were a handful of us, but I felt like my strategy was I didn't have the capacity to go out and try to reach every pastor and get every pastor to the table. But my job was to try and connect with the connectors. As many cities do, and especially larger cities, there's a number of different kind of pastoral networks. You've got your Black Pastors Network, your Hispanic Pastors Network. We've got something here called the Merge, which is typically a little bit more kind of white evangelical churches that get together. There's other pockets of maybe more progressive churches or whatever it might be. I could spend all day, every day going after 100 pastors a day, just trying to bring them to the table. Really, I felt like if I could just spend my energy trying to develop relationships with, let's just say 5 to 10 key connectors, a handful of people who have access and build and trust already with the Black Pastors Network, the Hispanic, all those different networks that I mentioned, if I could just build a relationship with them, not by any means for the sake of using them or trying to gain their access into something. But if I could invest in that relationship, even if I have a handful of conversations, even if I could just get 6 key connectors around the table together, the things we talk about will inevitably leak out into their conversations with their own networks. And so, the head of our economic development council, our police chief, the head of our, Black Ministerial Union, those are folks that I intentionally try to carve out time with, because when the head of our economic development council hears, hey, here are some things that church leaders are asking me in the midst of COVID-19. How do you think, Mr. Economic Development Council person, that we could use those resources they're trying to put at my feet? He's going back to his leadership, other city leaders, heads of major companies that are on his board. And now all of a sudden they're hearing that the church wants to be helpful with keeping small businesses afloat in the midst of COVID-19 shutdown. Well, that's a unique conversation.
Yeah.
And then when I can take, on the other side, when a pastor hears that, even though there's nothing a church can do to build better stormwater canals, but he hears our mayor talking about, hey, this keeps me up at night, how our stormwater is affecting our economy, then at least he goes back and he says, hey, I think we need to pay attention as taxpayers to what it is what our civic responsibilities are. Instead of trying to get around paying taxes or trying to pay as little as possible, maybe we should actually do our civic duty and be responsible for this, because this is making an economic impact in our city. So I think those are just things. Connecting with connectors was probably one of the most helpful strategies that we kind of implemented early on.
Yeah. So finding that key voice in the city, that leading voice, whether it's the mayor or somebody else, but then connecting with the connectors in their different pockets of influence and bringing them to the table to hear what that key voice is talking about, and continuing to put that in front of them, because that information will leak out into their networks that they're constantly connecting with.
Yeah. You were there, Jason, that you referenced it earlier, the meeting we had with the mayor, where Glenn Packey and one of our other pastors in town spoke. I'm confident, I'm pretty sure I can say with 100% confidence that you left that gathering, and within the next 3 weeks, at some point in front of your church, you said, hey guys, I was in a room with the mayor not too long ago, and I heard him say something. And you said that to the couple hundred people that were in the room that weekend.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that of the 120 pastors in that room, the vast majority probably did the same thing. Yeah. And so now all of a sudden 120 people heard a message, and now let's just call it 10 times that number, but that's super conservative. We could probably say 100 times that number.
Yeah. Easily.
12,000 people heard that message simply because 100 people sat in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. So, no, and I, just so you know, it didn't take me 2 or 3 weeks. You know me well. I said it that following Sunday.
I know that.
and after that meeting with the mayor, there were, half a dozen to 10 of us that got together literally immediately after the meeting. And I think we all made a commitment within an hour of that meeting with the mayor to say, let's not come back next year having heard what the mayor said and having done nothing about what he said. We've got to come back next year with having done something about what he said. And I think that is probably the next key step, possibly. Would you say? What would you say is the next key step?
And this is where I would say I'm the steward and the beneficiary of that decision that you and a handful of pastors made. So I was not leading a church. I was at a rescue mission. I was kind of brokering a conversation around a specific issue, and a handful of you guys decided, okay, we can't let this just fall flat on the floor. We have to make sure that the next time we have this conversation, we have something to show from it. And the fact that within a year, and our mayor, who's still in office, still tells this story, within a year, half of the churches that were in that room pooled together almost $1 million to be able to help establish the largest homeless shelter in our community, which is still going strong, by the way. That continues to impress him. I was in a private conversation with him, 6 weeks before the COVID thing, so late January. I was in a private conversation with our mayor, and he leaned over to me and he said, "How are you doing this?" He said, I had low expectations when I asked you guys to chip in on this homelessness thing. And he said, whether it's homelessness or now some of the other initiatives that we've started to kind of stick our hands in, he just said, you guys continue to exceed our expectations every time. And that's not bragging on Cause I Love You. That's bragging on the church.
Yeah.
And I think when the church, and you know this, when the right kind of church and the right kind of leaders get pointed in the right direction, and they're given the freedom to be able to do something, but maybe a few boundaries within which to do it, and the church can get after it and can make a huge difference. And like I said, I've been the beneficiary and the steward of being able to just be a part of that over the last handful of years.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit, Stu, because you started to allude to it here just a moment ago, about what some of the other programs or other initiatives Cause I Love You is now helping to really be the catalyst behind. And again, I want people to understand on the call, Cause I Love You is not a nonprofit or a not-for-profit that has programs that they do, but rather they help to highlight and bring to the surface or bring to awareness great things that are happening within the city. Could you maybe walk through some of the other ones that you guys are currently involved with? And then I want to get to this COVID-19 crisis and learn more about what you're doing currently as well.
Yeah. So essentially a few years ago, I mentioned, that the project we did to kind of collectively raise some money. You were here when we did that, to really help get that larger shelter off the ground, which it may have happened, who knows, otherwise, but it certainly wouldn't have happened in the right time frame. I can tell you that, if the church hadn't stepped in. When that happened, and I think, the homelessness thing really then had some movement in the right direction and has continued to progress in many ways, thanks to the faith community in Colorado Springs over the last few years. By no means is homelessness solved. It won't ever really be solved, but we've gotten to the point now where the network of agencies in our community really have the ability to deliver on what they're trying to accomplish with regard to homelessness. It doesn't mean that they don't need additional resources, volunteers, money, whatever it might be, but we now have a network that is accomplishing its mission. So really about maybe 2 years ago, in our next subsequent conversation with the mayor, which we now have every year, we basically kind of said, okay, in addition to homelessness, if we could still work on that, but then apply our hands to some other things. Again, we keep asking this question: what keeps you up at night? What are some of the things that you feel like the faith community could do something in? We can't build better bridges or better roads, but we can take care of people. Are there people issues that we can do something about? And he really pointed us in the direction of at-risk youth. Part of it comes from his own personal story. Part of it comes from just some of the things that he sees with underage drug abuse, gang involvement, youth incarceration, some of those things. And so we really started just doing some thinking, some talking with both local leaders as well as people around the country, and just saying, what are some things that we should pay attention to here? And one of the ones that stood out very early on, and we knew that it was going to be a matter of time until this one came up, was public schools. Yeah. And really, if you think about it, I mean, some period of decades ago, and they're gone, and it doesn't really matter how long ago, but at some point in the past, really churches were the centers of our community. And those days are gone. And we can spend all of our time lamenting or trying to get us back to that point, or we can just work with what we've got, because the reality is schools are now the centers of our community. And beyond education, people are going to their schools for daycare, for meals, for healthcare, for mental health care. A lot of different needs are being met, or at least are being put on the table at a local public school. And so they really are the centers of our neighborhoods. They're the centers of our community. We've just started to adopt a phrase, and I think at some point, I don't know if I can trademark it or not, but we've just started to say, as schools go, communities go, which is really true. When schools start to trend downward, you will notice that a community will soon follow. And the opposite is true. If a school starts to trend upward, the neighborhood around will start to do the same. So we've really tried to do some things to really bring the collective resources of the local church around local schools. It's not so much a program as it is just trying to pull partners together, a business, a church, a nonprofit, a mom who lives down the street from a public school, who stays at home while her kids are in class. Anybody who wants to be helpful to that school, we just bring them together, create some common language, sit them down with the principal, and much like we did with the mayor, we do with the principal of the school, and just say, tell us what's going on at your school. Can you give us a vision for what you see when you look out over this hallway or over this playground? When you stand in front of your teachers, what are some needs that you know they have that you just can't get to because you don't have enough money in the bank, or you don't have the right partner in the Rolodex, or whatever it might be? And so when we have those conversations and we get to hear from a principal about the great things happening at their school and some of the deficiencies, it allows this team of people, again, like a couple of our teams, we've got a real estate agent, a wealth broker, a church volunteer, a different church down the road, a Spanish-speaking church, and then a local nonprofit that does just kind of community advocacy things. They all sit around the table and they hear a principal talk about, I wish I could engage my parents more. We had to defund our basketball program. My teacher's lounge is so depressing that none of the teachers ever want to have their meetings in there. And we start to hear some of these things, and the realtor says, well, I've got connections with a designer. I think we could probably do some things to help spruce up your teacher's lounge. The nonprofit's like, well, I've got a mentoring program at my nonprofit. I think that there's probably some things we can do to kind of give your parents and your teens something to be able to talk about together. And everybody's resources pool kind of combines. The resource pool gets bigger. And instead of it just being this one-to-one, the church is trying to take care of all the needs at the school, and they're kind of burning through their resources and doing so. When you add these teams together and create this collaboration, and then they hear a vision and they hear some opportunities to go after some tangible things, man, I'll tell you, it's just been incredible to see how quickly these teams of churches and partners and all this kind of stuff have responded. And I mean, we've done some projects at schools that have been $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 worth of work for pennies on the dollar. And then there have been other things we've just engaged over the course of the last several months. And the principal is now gushing and just saying, whatever it is that you guys want to do to our school next, come on in. You're welcome here because you've been so helpful. And I mean, what church wouldn't want an invitation like that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I hear some reoccurring themes, Stu. Number one, I hear that you guys are identifying key people, influencers, places within your community. So you identified the mayor from a city level, but then you've gone into a suburb level and a neighborhood level and said, okay, who's a key influencer here? Principal of my local school is probably going to be somebody that a lot of families listen to because that person is influencing a lot of the kids in this neighborhood or suburb. And so you've gone and again, instead of saying, here are all the things that this school is doing wrong or need to improve on or whatever, they hear enough of that already. They're getting probably reports of that from the education department on a consistent basis. They don't need another person to tell them, here's where you can improve. They rather need somebody to say, how can I help? What are you looking to do? And then just listen, learn, and then actually launch into doing something. I think that's super important.
Well, and I think at least I'm sure you are, I'm sure a number of your listeners are aware of this idea of asset-based community development. And essentially it's this idea of how do we take what's already here and contribute it towards the improvement of our community, our neighborhood, or arena, whatever that might be. What assets do we have that we can use to develop our community? And that's essentially what we're trying to do. The assets of the faith community have unfortunately either been misdirected or they've been sitting on the sidelines for a long time, but they're there. And can we contribute them to making a better community, to making a better society? The assets of a school or a neighborhood, even in an under-resourced, impoverished, minority, majority, if that's the case, community, there are people, there are resources, there are assets within the community that can make that place fantastic. They may just be lying dormant. They may be lacking the catalyst to help them kind of get themselves off the sidelines and into the game. But that's really what I think the role of the church could be. What would it look like if the church were the great catalyst for some of the amazing assets of a community to start coming to life? Yeah. I mean, that to me, that sounds like the kingdom.
Yeah, it sure does. Hey, talk to me a little bit about what you're currently doing with the COVID-19 crisis. So, for example, schools are closed. People are, homeschooling right now, and so there may not be the access that there once was or whatever. Help me understand, if I'm a church leader and I want our church to make a difference in the community, especially during this crisis that we're currently in, or even if I'm just Joe guy on the couch saying, I want to serve my community. I want to be making this place a better place to live in this current crisis. What would be your recommendations on participating during this time? And what are you guys currently seeing?
Yeah. I think the first thing that I would say is I would quote, somebody you and I oftentimes share quotes back and forth about, our friend Andy Stanley, who I heard him say something years ago. I've heard him say it several times since, where he said, do for one what you wish you could do for everybody. Yeah. I'm probably kind of hacking that a little bit up a bit.
It's close.
That's essentially the idea.
Do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. But
okay,
he just loves rhyming stuff.
Yeah, right. So I think there are, and especially several weeks ago when the whole thing, at least in our timing here in the U.S., started to really blow up, maybe a month or so ago, everybody was searching for, man, what could we do that would make the biggest possible impact in our city? And we had churches that were willing to drop tens of thousands of dollars on extra hospital masks. And there were people who wanted to stand up entire daycare centers overnight for first responders and frontline healthcare workers. All amazing things and all needed, that's for sure. But then there were a lot of people who were, individuals, smaller churches, folks who were in little tiny offices somewhere that didn't have more than a handful of dollars and a handful of hours. And they thought, well, gosh, I guess everybody else is already handling things. To which I was aware, we have neighbors right down the road who just, they can't get out and go to the grocery store. They've got a compromised immune system. They know that when they leave the house, it could be a death sentence for them. But they can't eat, and they've got no family. They've got no social network in town. Somebody has to be taking care of them. And so one of the things that we started doing was, here in Colorado Springs and many communities around the U.S., at least, with our local United Way, have a helpline where people just dial the numbers 211, and it gets them straight in touch with an operator, essentially, who just kind of takes a few minutes to have a conversation and say, what's your need? What's the crisis that's going on? It's a non-emergency helpline where somebody can call in and say, I have a need and I don't know where to go. We established pretty early on a relationship with that helpline program, and just said, if there are needs that come in that you don't know where to send them to, or that aren't a good fit for a local service agency, Catholic Charities, Springs Rescue Mission, if they're facing homelessness, some other organization that's designed to really help, from an agency side, would you send those to us and we'll try and figure it out? And so pretty early on, we started getting 5 calls, then 10 calls, and then a few more over the last, I think 4.5, now almost 5 weeks. We've been able to, when those calls come in, we connect the person who's in need with a nearby church who deploys a volunteer to just go meet the need. Go shop for groceries, go pick up food from the local food bank, go make a run to the pharmacy to pick up their medication. We had somebody show up to just deliver food, but they found out the person they're delivering food to was celebrating was not celebrating, but was on his 74th birthday. And so not only did they show up with food deliveries, they showed up with cupcakes that they had baked and little candles stuck in them, and set them on the porch from 6 feet away, knocked on the door, and just sang happy birthday to him. So we've done that almost 250 times over the course of the last 5 weeks. So about 50 times a week, a local church, through just our connection, we're just the broker, a local church is sending somebody over to go meet a need at an individual level that all these people who are playing at kind of the community level are frankly kind of too busy to pay attention to. And I get it. If you're managing a hospital system, you don't have time to pay attention to that one little person. If you're our police chief, you're not trying to think about the one person who's in crisis and is kind of in mental anguish because they don't know where else to turn right now. You can't send an officer over there to go address that issue, but a church can. And so to be able to do that and to establish that partnership, that's now led to actually a larger effort where we now have about 5 or 6 local agencies, including our United Way, our Salvation Army, and a few others, who are now directing the needs for almost all seniors who are unable to leave their home. If they have a need for food, that call comes to us. And through the local church network that we have, we deploy a nearby volunteer who can then go meet that need. That's now been happening for 2 weeks, and it's been hundreds of responses. So to just, again, common cause, common connections, and then just giving us a direction to run in. It's allowed, frankly, a lot of our smaller and mid-sized churches who don't have a ton of resources, they've been the ones that have been just all-stars in that initiative. And we've had churches that have maybe 25 to 50 people on a weekend. They've been meeting needs by the dozen every week, which has just been phenomenal. So those have been some really fun stories to tell. There's some other kind of larger things that we're doing now to just try and think about how do we help catalyze the faith community to be partners in the restoration, the rebuilding process, as we start to eye what it could look like to come out of this thing. There's going to be a lot of folks who are in physical need, a lot of spiritual need, a lot of kind of mental health care needs. And so trying to really rally the resources of the faith community to be partners in that. Yeah. But it's just been to be able to just meet individual needs one at a time, but, do it 50 or 60 times a week over the last handful of weeks. It's kind of, I got a message today, a text message from somebody who's kind of a key collaborator in our city that just says, I don't know how you're doing it, but it seems like every Zoom call I'm on, the local church keeps showing up because I love you, keep showing up as a great partner. And so that's just been thrilling to watch.
Stu, I could, listen to these stories all day because it's so inspiring. It's so inspiring what you guys are doing. And my hope is that somebody listening to this might say, okay, I'm going to go find out who my mayor is or find out whoever the key voice is in my city. I'm going to go and start connecting with other connectors. And we just want to listen. And then we want to launch into whatever it is that they tell us is the greatest need. That's my hope, is that what's happening in Colorado Springs would replicate itself across the world, literally across the planet, as the faith community gets engaged with serving their community. I was inspired back in 2014, before I actually moved to Colorado Springs in 15, through a guy that you probably are familiar with, a guy named Jeff Henderson, pastor of a local church in Atlanta. He was launching a campus in Atlanta called Gwinnett Church. And before they launched, he made this statement. He said, for far too long, the faith community or the church has been known for what they're against. They wanted to be a church that was known for what they were for. And he since has written a book about it, which is a fantastic read. And I just feel like the church in Colorado Springs, at least from my perspective, is now changing the perspective of a lot of people in the community to say, hey, the church is really for this city. And I'm so thankful that you guys are doing what you're doing. And I think you're making a huge kingdom impact. So thank you so much for what you're doing.
Yeah, and I'm glad you say that. We have 4 core values at Cause I Love You, one of which is city positive. And we have just made it a stated value that we want to always speak well of our city. Doesn't mean we'll always agree. And I'd say maybe perhaps in the most dire situations or extraordinary situations, perhaps we might not even align. But at least right now, and certainly for anything that we could possibly foresee coming up, we just want to make a commitment that is public to say we're for the city and not against. We're not even against poverty. We're for people's thriving. Yeah. And so I would say, let's, like to Jeff's point, let's stand for things and stop spending all of our time standing against things.
Yeah. Stu, this keeps you incredibly busy, I'm sure. I'm sure you're like, hey, I just got a text message and we're meeting all these needs and I'm connecting with all these guys. And you've obviously reached some personal goals that you wanted to achieve, being able to make a difference in the city that you live in, which I think is a great goal for all of us to aspire to. But at the same time, you have to care for your own soul and you have to care for yourself, or else, like so many of us have heard this analogy, if you don't put the mask on yourself before you help others, you won't be around to help other people. So could you walk us through what are some of the key practices or habits that you have personally that help to keep your soul healthy so that you can reach these goals of serving and loving the city so well?
Yeah, I think I don't think I would trust the leader who says that they've got a whole series of regimens and rituals figured out that keeps their soul healthy. I think any healthy leader recognizes the need to do it more.
It's why I call them practices, Stu, because I'm still practicing.
Yeah,
I haven't figured it out. They're just practices.
So true. I think for me, I made a commitment a few years ago. For me, just in my own schedule, it works best for me. The first Friday of the month, I take the afternoon off to just go pray. And it's a specific type, like it's professional prayer. It's prayer out of what I do for my vocation. So city things, not necessarily things related to a church, but I might be led to pray for my board and the churches that they lead. But I'm more specifically thinking about what should COSILoveYou be paying attention to? What are the things that God would lead and guide us as the faith community to do as we seek to partner with our city? And so I do that, and it's the hardest thing for me to make time for. And it's also the most important thing I think I've ever done in my schedule. Every month, there are always things that try to violate that time. And a handful of times I've had to let it go because of, frankly, a couple weeks ago, there was a coronavirus thing that was, we were in the midst of shutting down our entire city. And there were other things that were frankly just urgent. And so I just shifted that prayer time. But for the most part, 90% of the time, that first Friday afternoon of the month has been the one discipline that I think has been the most beneficial thing for me. I always come away at least feeling like I needed that, if not feeling like the Lord has spoken to me in some kind of way, nudged me in a direction, if not kind of really put something in front of my face where he said, this is what I'm asking you to do. So that has been a great discipline for me. I would say one of the best upside of the coronavirus shutdown for me has been just an extended time to just listen and journal in the morning. I have learned to become a more introspective person over the years. And so as somebody who's always, like you, Jason, one of the things that I know you and I think about all the time is organizational dynamics, growth, change. How do we manage and lead through those things? Those are the books we read. Those are the podcasts we listen to. I think for me, it's so easy for me to get caught up in all these external things that I've been involved in, I've been invited into. And I think the opportunity for me to just slow down and write, I write in my journal. I might only fill up a page or two, and I probably do it 4 or 5 times a week. But that page or two, it slows me down, and it does make me more attentive to what's stirring inside. I think about my relationship with my wife. I think about my relationship with my kids and my role as a dad, which is so far from perfect. It's just laughable. And so when I slow down and I do those things on a more consistent basis, I find myself more able to hear what God might be saying, especially in a season like this one where there's so much just clatter and noise around. So those are the two things. Certainly time in the Word, certainly my own kind of, time in prayer, although I wish I was so much better at both of those things. But those two additional practices of just journaling and kind of a specific Sabbath prayer for a handful of hours every month have been really life-giving for me.
Yeah, those are fantastic habits, Stu. I know for me personally, driven, you said it, you called me out. I listen to certain podcasts, I read certain types of books, and all they do is quite frankly, all they do is speed things up. They don't slow things down. Mm-hmm. And I've been impressed over the last couple of years by a number of great writers and great leaders who had a very deep faith that the Christian life cannot be led at frantic speed. A Christian life has to be a slowed down life. And I think that habit of journaling, spending time in silence and solitude and just reflection is something I've only begun to practice, and I call it a practice because it's not a habit yet. But man, it's been so life-giving. I'm so glad that you shared that. A great reminder. And I love this first Friday afternoon prayer concept of just taking an afternoon to spend every month in prayer. That's such a great rhythm. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I I'm no prophet, but I do hope that one of the things that comes out of this whole coronavirus thing is some sort of reset button that I think allows many of us who have probably been living at an unhealthy pace, allows us to be able to say, you know what, I think there's probably some things that I could set aside that I thought were really important and maybe aren't quite as urgent as I thought they were. And so I'm hoping that for me, I can pay attention to some of these things that on the other side of coronavirus shutdown and all this stuff, that I can at least say that was a good opportunity for me to kind of reset and reevaluate what it was that I was spending so much time doing that perhaps wasn't quite as important as I thought it was. I know for me, one of the things that's come out has just been, I tie so much of my sense of value of the day to how busy I was. And I'm recognizing how just fallible that line of thinking is. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so rich, man. We could spend a lot of time there. I know in a lot of societies in the past, people that were very successful were actually the people that had the least to do. And today it seems like the mark of being truly successful are the people that have the most things on their agenda and on their schedule. And perhaps maybe on the other side of this thing, we might go back to a little bit more simpler way of living, possibly. So, Stu, thank you so much, man. Thank you so much for your time, and such a pleasure to reconnect and to hear what God is doing. I really appreciate your time today.
Well, let's hope that whatever good things were said today just makes its way into greater kingdom effort around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Jason.